Hey friends, it's finally time to get these broccoli seedlings planted. These seedlings grew in my house for a few weeks. They've now been hardening off outside of my deck, gradually getting used to the sunshine and the outside conditions for about a week and a half or so, and it is finally time to plant them in the garden. So broccoli is one of those crops that can be a little bit challenging. I know it took me several years of unsuccessfully growing broccoli before I actually did have any success with it. And over the years, I was determined to improve my broccoli growing, so I kept trying it. And eventually I did figure out a couple things the things that I wasn't doing that I really needed to be doing to be successful with broccoli. It is a little bit breezy out here today, so I'm hoping that there won't be too much wind noise on the camera for you. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me and enjoy spending this day outside my garden as we plant the broccoli. I do also I'm hoping if we have enough time today, I'd like to be able to get my cauliflower seedlings planted and my kale and cabbage as well. Those are all going to be planted pretty much the same way as broccoli. So we're going to start with broccoli, but if we have enough time, I want to get those planted as well. So here you can see my tray of broccoli seedlings. They've gone through a little bit over the past few weeks. I'm sure if you've been following along with me, then you have heard some of the stories. But I have 3 different varieties of broccoli here. I've got imperial broccoli, which is new to me. I've never grown that before. I've got Romanesco broccoli, which I tried last year but was not successful. And then finally, I've got Eastern Magic broccoli, which even though those seedlings don't look as impressive as some of the others, that is my tried and true variety. So Eastern Magic, as I mentioned, is my tried and true broccoli variety, but I did want to grow a couple others this year as well. I have been wanting to grow Romanesco just because, it's a really very interesting plant. It's kind of, some people will consider a broccoli, some people will consider a cauliflower. It really depends on who you ask. It's kind of, maybe halfway in between. But it's a really beautiful, unique plant, and I've heard that it has really great flavor. So I've been really wanting to try that one. Last year I did try just 3 plants. They were not successful, so I'm going to try again this year. The imperial broccoli, I've never grown before. I don't really know anything about it. I'm basically growing that one, hoping to extend my broccoli harvest season. When you grow a lot of broccoli and you grow all the same variety, they're all going to be ready in harvestable condition at a pretty similar time. And if you want to extend your broccoli harvest and not have, like a dozen heads of broccoli all coming in within the same week, it's nice to grow a couple different varieties that have different maturity dates. So the imperial broccoli, as I said, I'm not familiar with it, but it had good reviews. It sounded like a good variety. And the maturity date is a little bit later than my Eastern Magic. So I'm hoping by growing that one, I'll be able to extend the season a little bit. So the first thing that I did in preparation for growing broccoli was to prep the planting site. Broccoli is a fairly heavy feeder. It does need a pretty rich soil. You can see I've topped my soil with a couple inches of nice fresh compost. One of the reasons that I was not all that successful when I initially tried growing broccoli was because I did not give it enough nutrients. Broccoli in particular really likes nitrogen. Basically anything in the brassica family is going to be a really heavy feeder, particularly of nitrogen. So before I put a couple inches of compost on this bed, I did top it with just a little sprinkling of blood meal. Blood meal is a really good source of nitrogen, so I just used an organic blood meal, just a little bit. You don't want to overdo it. So I added that, and then I put a couple inches of compost on top of that. So our soil should be nice and prepped for our broccoli. So I'm going to be spacing these broccoli transplants probably, roughly 18 inches or so apart in all directions. I'm not going to be all that precise with it, but I find when I do this 8-foot by 4-foot raised bed, what I usually try to do is get 12 broccoli seedlings in the bed. So I usually do basically 3 staggered rows of 4 plants each, and I find that works really well. So that's what I'm going to do. First, I'm going to go ahead and lay out in this broccoli bed where I'm going to put this broccoli. I should also mention, you can see this tray of broccoli here. These are the broccoli seedlings that I started inside. I did also this year experiment with winter sowing some broccoli. Basically, that's a technique where you take an old milk jug or a water jug or something like that, you put it outside and kind of use it as a greenhouse, and you start some seedlings in there. You plant them really early, and they won't sprout initially because it's usually pretty cold. But, as the season goes on, they do eventually sprout, surrounded like in that little greenhouse. And the idea of growing plants that way is that they're already hardened off. You don't have to go through that hardening off process. It also saves a little bit of space in your house. You know, a lot of us are limited on space under the grow lights. I know I definitely am. So I wanted to do a little experiment and compare the seedlings I started indoors with the seedlings I started under the grow lights. So I'm going to be planting some of those as well. So I went and grabbed some of my brassicas, my winter sown brassicas from the deck, so we can take a look at those. This is broccoli. This one I believe has kale, and this one has cabbages. So we'll just open these up and take a look at how they look inside. So this is my container of broccoli seedlings. I've got a couple Imperial, or I think I've got 6 Imperial and 6 Eastern Magic in here. So we're gonna open this up and see how they compare. Now these seedlings, I can tell the winter sown seedlings are a little bit smaller than the seedlings I started inside, which makes sense. I mean, they germinated a little bit later. But the idea with this sowing method is that the seedlings are supposed to be stronger. And so even though they're a little bit smaller, the idea is that they are supposed to catch up. So I'm going to plant some of each of these, and as the season goes on, we're going to compare them. You can see they're definitely smaller, but they seem to be possibly a little stronger. I guess we'll plant them and time will tell. So these 6 over here are Imperial broccoli, and these 6 are Eastern Magic. So I'll plant a couple of each varieties of this and the same variety that were started in the house as well. So first I'm going to lay out where I want the broccoli to be. So when I say staggered rows, I mean there's going to be 3 rows, 1 on each side and 1 down the middle of the bed, 4 plants each, but I don't want them completely lined up. I want them staggered like this, like that. The idea of staggering the rows like that is to give each plant the maximum space possible while still fitting the maximum amount of plants in each bed. So, you know, there's many different ways to do it. You definitely don't have to lay out your plants that way. That's just how it works for me. So I'm not sure how well you can see, but I've made a little mark with my shovel where I want to lay out each plant. So I'm going to start with these 2 broccoli plants down here. These are Imperial transplants. So I'm just going to dig a little hole, loosen up some soil here. I did mention that I already put a really thin sprinkling of blood meal all along the entire top of the bed, but I am going to put a really small handful of blood meal in each individual planting hole as well, just to make sure that each broccoli has enough nutrients, has enough nitrogen. Now, I should also mention, when I sprinkled a little bit of blood meal over the top of the bed, I also added a little bit of slow release organic fertilizer as well. If you did not add slow release organic fertilizer over the entire bed, I don't always do that. If I don't do that, then I add a small handful to the planting hole as well. Since I did that over the entire bed, I'm not going to worry about adding that in the planting hole this time. So I'm just going to add a little bit of blood meal, and I'm going to work it into the soil. I don't want to just leave it loose in there. I want it to be mixed into all the surrounding soil so that as the broccoli's roots spread out, it will have enough nitrogen wherever it spreads. So I'm going to gently put the broccoli transplant into the hole and gently smooth the soil back around it. I want to plant it about the same depth that it grew in the pot. You can see this leaf was a little bit loose and broke off. In case you missed my last video, my brassica seedlings had a little bit of trauma over the past few days, so they're not in ideal condition, but I'm pretty confident that these are going to bounce back and do really well and yield for us. So hopefully that is the case. Definitely stay tuned and find out along with me. Now, I will say you can probably plant these slightly deeper than they were in the pot. They're not like tomatoes where they're going to make roots all along the stem. So I don't want to plant these significantly more deeply than they're planted in the pots. But if you just add maybe an inch or so, I'm probably not even doing that. I'm keeping the soil level about the same as it was in the pot. So over on this side, I'm also going to plant an Imperial broccoli seedling just for the sake of keeping the same varieties together and making it easier to remember which is which. But I am going to try on this side one of these winter sown seedlings, and we'll see how it does. So I'm planting this exactly the same way. I prepared the hole with a little bit of blood meal, and I'm just going to carefully prick out one of these imperial broccoli seedlings from this little container here. So you can see I just tried to carefully remove that with my trowel, including as much soil and roots as possible. So I'm just going to stick that right in here, just like the others, and carefully smooth the soil back around it. So here's our little winter sown seedling. You can see it is definitely smaller than the seedlings sown inside. But I am curious, if you've grown winter sown seedlings before, especially broccoli or anything similar, is it true that it does catch up as the season goes on? I mean, it does make sense that this is going to have less of a shock, less of a change from, you know, just from being in this little container to being out in the garden, as opposed to the others, which have to deal with the change from being out in my house, then on my deck, and then here in the garden. So it does make sense that this one would be stronger. I'm really curious if you have experience with that, how did it go? And if you don't have experience, then stay tuned and you'll find out along with me. So the first row is planted. This is all imperial broccoli. I think I'm going to do the next row Romanesco broccoli, followed by Eastern Magic, and then I'll have one final row that will probably have one of each plant in it, just for the sake of remembering which is which. So here I've got my Romanesco broccoli or cauliflower seedlings laid out where I'm going to plant them. I'm going to plant them exactly the same way I planted the imperial, and then I'll do another row of Eastern Magic exactly the same way. I'll meet you back here when everything's planted and show you how it all looks. So the broccoli's all planted in this bed. On this final row here, I did Romanesco in the middle, imperial on the far side, and then over here is Eastern Magic. The two, imperial and Eastern Magic, these are both the winter sown plants. My winter sown plants of Romanesco got damaged by my chickens, so I didn't have any of those to compare. So we won't be able to compare all three varieties, but we'll be able to compare 2 out of 3, so I think that's pretty good. And if the winter sown seedlings perform better than the traditional indoor started seedlings, then I'll definitely make sure to include some winter sown Romanesco next year as well. So our broccoli is all planted, but we're not quite done with this bed. There's 2 more things that I want to do that are going to give us the highest chance possible of success with this bed and make the most use of space. One thing I find is really important to prioritize in a vegetable garden is mulch. Now there's lots of different options for mulch, but one of my favorite types of mulch, and this is the type I use whenever it makes sense, whenever it's possible, is called a living mulch. Now the idea, you know, mulch has so many benefits for the vegetable garden. It suppresses weeds, it conserves moisture, it just keeps the ground from being bare. You know, the ground doesn't really like to be bare. There's a saying that says, Mother Nature is modest. If you don't cover her, she's going to cover herself with weeds. And, you know, we want to prevent that as much as possible in the vegetable garden. So rather than allowing this bare earth to get covered with weeds, I'm going to cover it with something of my choosing. Now, I could use straw or leaves or something like that. Those would be great options. But I'm going to try a living mulch. I'm going to plant some lettuce seedlings in between these broccoli plants. The idea is that the lettuce then grows and covers the ground, and, you know, it provides all the benefits that a traditional mulch would provide, with the addition of giving me an additional harvest. Now, I did do this last year with great success, so I'm hoping for similar success this year. The idea is that it's a symbiotic relationship between the 2 plants. You know, the broccoli benefits from being mulched, from having weeds suppressed, from having the soil stay moist, things like that. It helps the soil stay cooler, which is beneficial for the broccoli. And the lettuce actually benefits because once you get into the heat of summer, lettuce does not like extreme hot temperatures. It doesn't like extreme amounts of sunshine, especially when it's also dealing with those hot temperatures. So right now, while it's cool out, the broccoli plants are small. That's going to allow my lettuce to have exposure to the sunshine that it needs to grow. But once summer hits and it starts getting hotter and sunnier, these broccoli plants are going to be really large, and they're going to provide some shade for my lettuce, which is going to help the lettuce to stay tender and sweeter longer, hopefully prevent bolting a little bit longer. And it benefits both plants. So whenever it makes sense to do a living mulch, that's my preferred method, just because, you know, I'm short on space. I like to pack as much harvest into that small space as I can, so a living mulch is a great way to do that. So between this broccoli, before I water this broccoli in, I'm going to go ahead and plant some lettuce seeds really thickly between the broccoli plants. Wind's trying to blow my hat off here. And then we're just going to water it all in together. So I've got a lot of different lettuce varieties here. I'm just going to choose a couple that I think will work, that'll work pretty well. We'll use a little bit of Merlot because I like that nice rich color. Let's see, we don't want winter lettuces for this. I want some summer lettuces. This ruby red leaf lettuce I haven't grown before, but it's supposed to be heat resistant, so that's a good one. And let's see. Summer lettuce blend, we'll try some of that. Marvel of Four Seasons is an excellent choice. And I think we'll also do some butter crunch. So to plant this lettuce, I'm just going to make a little furrow between these broccoli seedlings here. Just pretty shallow, maybe 1/2 inch or so. Then I'm just going to take these seeds and I'm going to sprinkle them pretty thickly along this furrow here. We're not looking to get full-size lettuce heads. If I wanted full-size lettuce heads, I would space them out a little bit more, and I also probably wouldn't be using them in this way as a living mulch. I'm basically planting these really closely together. I'm going to use the cut and come again method. You'll see as the season goes on when this is ready to harvest, but I'm basically harvesting these as baby greens. I'm just going to snip them off, leaving a couple inches behind. They'll regrow, and we should be able to get a couple harvests out of them that way. Because that's how I'm growing them, I'm going to sow them really thickly. Then I'm just going to brush the soil back over the furrow just to cover up our lettuce seeds. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the rest of the spaces between my broccoli seedlings with this lettuce, and then we'll get the whole thing watered in together. So there's our broccoli bed, all planted with broccoli and planted with seeds for our living lettuce mulch, and all nicely watered in. There is one more really important thing that I want to do to this broccoli bed before we're completely done. I have this insect netting here, which you can see is a really fine mesh. So this is designed to keep out really any insects that you're going to encounter. Specifically in the case of broccoli and other brassicas, we're trying to keep out the cabbage worm and the cabbage looper, I think, are the two main types of caterpillars that I tend to get on my broccoli. I know a lot of people also struggle with flea beetles on their broccoli. I personally haven't had an issue with that, but using a netting like this will work to keep out flea beetles as well. So you can see that I have these hoops installed on my bed. One of the primary reasons is to support this netting. The first year that I grew broccoli, my plants were pretty much devoured by those little cabbage worm caterpillars that you get on your plants. They just love broccoli and other brassicas, and in my area they're very prevalent. So those caterpillars actually come from eggs that are laid on the plants by a little white moth. So the idea, those eggs are not in the soil. Those eggs are laid directly on the plants. The idea is that if we can keep that moth from ever finding our plants or from ever coming in contact with our plants, keep that moth from being able to lay the eggs, that's going to protect our broccoli from being eaten. So I like to get this insect netting. We're just going to cover the entire bed, and then I'm just going to use, just to weight down the edges, I just use random rocks that I have lying around or random boards. You do want to make sure that it goes all the way to the ground and that every little opening is covered, because those moths, they're opportunistic, and if they can find a way in, then they definitely will. So if you have a second person to help you, this is definitely a lot easier and faster as a two-person job, but it can easily be done as a one-person job too. Just takes a little bit more patience. If you don't want to use a cover like this, another organic option for pest control, specifically for cabbage worms, is to use BT, which is a spray that you can spray on the plants. It's a biological control. It has a microorganism in it that the cabbage worms, or really any caterpillar, will ingest, and then it causes them to die. So it only harms insects in the larval stage, so it is definitely a much better option than many other pesticides that can harm pollinators and other insects as well. I prefer to not spray anything in my garden whenever possible. So by using a control like this, I find that I'm able to keep my broccoli completely spray-free. And also, it's a little bit of work to install it at the beginning. It's a little bit of work to take this off every time I need to harvest. But I think that it is overall less work than having to spray BT or anything like that regularly would be. So this just gives me produce that I feel really good about growing and harvesting. And honestly, it is really simple. So this is how I do it every year. So our broccoli is all tucked in here. We're gonna wait for that lettuce to germinate, which should happen really fast. In this other bed back here, I'm going to be planting more broccoli. So exact same method. I'm just going to put 12 broccoli plants in this bed. I'm going to put some type of living mulch here. I may use more lettuce. I might use some arugula or some other greens, something similar to that. And then we're just going to cover this just like we did the broccoli in the front. So I'm just going to go ahead and get that all planted. I do want to mention that it would make things simpler to keep track of which variety is which if I planted, say, this bed all with Imperial and the other one all with Eastern Magic or something like that. The reason why I am distributing a few of each variety in each bed is that it's basically, you know, this is my experiment and that's kind of my control. I'm trying to compare those two varieties against each other, the Eastern Magic and the Imperial, but I feel like it's not a fair comparison if they're not growing in exactly the same area. This bed here in the back gets a little bit more shade than that bed in the front, so I want to make sure that they have equal growing conditions, equal sun, basically equal everything, so that I can really get a fair comparison between the different varieties and also between the winter sown plants versus the plants that I started inside. So I'm just gonna go ahead and plant out this whole bed with more broccoli, and I'll meet you back here when I'm done. So we had a productive afternoon. I got 2 beds of broccoli planted. You can see there and there behind me. Planted 12 plants of broccoli in each of those beds, plus we planted our living mulch of lettuce. I do have one more bed I need to plant with kale and cabbage and cauliflower, and I've got some sprouting broccoli too. I think that I probably am not going to get to that today because I need to head inside and get ready to start making dinner. But thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I may end up putting another video, maybe a vlog style video of planting the other seedlings. We'll see what happens. Either way, I'll definitely show you once it's done. So thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you're having a great day, and I hope that you are ready to grow lots of broccoli this year. I'll see you next time.